Awesome. Thanks so much for having me with you today. I wish I could be there in Madison with you. I'm married to a Wisconsinite who's behind the camera helping me. He graduated from UWM and grew up in Milwaukee and majored in architecture, and I'm lucky to be married to one of you. So about 15 years ago, I read a book that wasn't unusual for me. I've always been a really big reader, but Michael and I had just gotten married, and we thought it would make us sound really intellectual to our friends if we told them we were reading a book out loud together. So we picked this book called Undaunted Courage by Stephen Ambrose. I don't know whether any of you have read that Pulitzer Prize winning book. It's a great book for a book club if y'all are looking for other books to read. But it came out during the bicentennial of the Lewis and Clark expedition to the Pacific Ocean. That's what the book was about. Now, I grew up in South Carolina. That's where I am now. If you can't tell by now, I've never lived out of the South. And I had to take U.S. history in the 8th grade in school in South Carolina, and I didn't learn much about anything in school in South Carolina. We trade places with Mississippi and Alabama for having the worst schools in America. So when I learned about Lewis and Clark, they were this tiny, boring paragraph in my history book. They followed Sacagawea to the Pacific. They came home. That was it. I memorized that to write it on a test, because that's how we teach history in America. You memorize boring lists and dates and names, and as soon as we're tested on it, we forget a bunch of that. So I forgot about them until I picked up Undaunted Courage and read it with my husband, and I got a very different picture of that trip. Meriwether Lewis, William Clark, 31 other individuals, mostly 20-year-old dudes, were screwing their way across North America. They were sleeping with all the native tribes because the natives believed if they could get their women to sleep with these men, it would steal their power. And if you're a 20-year-old dude, you're apparently up for having your power stolen a lot. So they were having a really big time on this expedition. They were writing about it in excruciating detail in their journals. They were also doing some upstanding things. Lewis was one of America's first scientists. He was cataloging a bunch of new plant and animal life for science. Clark's maps of that landscape are still the seminal picture of what we know it looked like back then. But they were having a really big time too. When the first editor of the journals got all their journals and saw the sheer volume of big time they bragged about having to them, he redacted all of that out of the first edition of the journals. Imagine how many more copies they might have sold if they'd been more like 50 Shades of the expedition. But he thought the American people would be scandalized to know that these men who were supposed to be upstanding examples were carrying on like that. I, however, thought, wow, if they taught history like that when I was 13, I would have been fascinated. I would have probably majored in history. It's really the first time people from history came to life for me, and I wanted to learn more about them. It's also the first time I learned how Meriwether Lewis died. I don't know whether any of you know how he died. I didn't before I read Undaunted Courage. So if you Google Meriwether Lewis' death, Google will tell you that he committed suicide on the Natchez Trace about 70 miles south of Nashville, Tennessee. He was 35. It was 3 years after the expedition ended. The suicide crowd say he couldn't handle being a politician. Imagine that today. So he spiraled into depression and drink, and he shot himself once in the head, but that didn't kill him. So he shot himself again in the gut, and he died. But if you Google Meriwether Lewis murder, you can read for hours all the different conspiracy theories of who might have wanted to whack him, because apparently a number of people wanted to kill him. We don't know what happened that night on the Trace. The official position of the U.S. government is that he died under mysterious circumstances. So the people in Washington can't get it together and make up their minds and agree even about that. But what we do know happened that night comes from one woman who was there, who changed her story 4 times between the time it happened and the time she died almost 50 years later. Nobody came out from Washington to investigate the death of this great American explorer. They dug a hole and threw him in it. They didn't dig it deep enough the first time, so wild animals dug him up and dragged him around the clearing, and they had to dig a deeper hole and put trash on it to keep the animals out. That is unfortunately sometimes how we treat great people who've done great things in America. So he lay in an unmarked grave with trash on it for almost 50 years in Tennessee. In 1848, the Tennessee state legislature decided it was appalling that this American hero was buried in their state without a marker, so they exhumed him and erected the monument that you can see if you go to the Meriwether Lewis site on the Natchez Trace today and visit it, and maybe some of you have been there. I thought that was really sad. We all want to be remembered for something when we're gone, don't we? It's a human thing to want. Lewis wrote about how he wanted to be remembered in his journals on the eve of his 32nd birthday. But who writes history? The winners write history, and we're learning in the past few weeks that the oppressors also write history. So because Lewis was a 35-year-old guy who died of possible mental illness in 1809, he was definitely one of history's losers. So if you didn't grow up in a state that touched that expedition or one of the people on it, they weren't taught in all U.S. history books until the 1960s, and Lewis wasn't recognized for his scientific accomplishments until 1991, when William Clark was finally officially made co-captain of the expedition, almost 200 years after it happened, and Sacagawea and York Clark Slade were officially recognized by the United States government for the contributions they made to that expedition that weren't even cared about in the day it happened. So I thought that was really sad, and I wanted to do something to honor Lewis. I didn't care how he died. I decided I'm going to write a book about him, but I don't want to write a history book because you can't make stuff up when you write history books, and I wanted to make stuff up. So I decided, since he had this unsolved mysterious death, I could exhume him. He was so young when he died. What might he do if he could do something else and have another adventure? So I hung him up between life and death and decided he could have this new adventure along the Natchez Trace, use conflict from history to inform the plot. My paranormal historical thriller was so unique, there wasn't even a genre for it on Amazon. And agents in New York say they wanted unique books, and I believed them. So I pitched 100 of them my book, baby, and several of them got back to me and said, wow, you really can write, but this is too unique for us to sell. You're going to have to pick a slot and rewrite it. The last agent who rejected it said, I grew up in Oregon. I love this story, but Meriwether Lewis cannot be doing any of this stuff. Nobody will believe it, even though I represented the book that turned Abraham Lincoln into a vampire slayer. So when I got that rejection, I thought nobody in New York City is going to understand my little book, baby. But a small press right here in South Carolina said, we'll publish it. You're going to have to get people to read it. So on March the 1st, 2014, everybody could read it, and I want people to read it because I'm proud of it. But people don't decide what to read based on me wanting them to read it. You know, Oprah was never going to pick my book, baby, as her book club pick. Nobody in Wisconsin at any libraries or anywhere else were going to carry my book, baby, even though they do today. That's why I'm speaking to you today, because I was supposed to be at a library in Wisconsin for an event. So it was going to be a really hard time for me to get anybody on this planet to pick my book, baby, to read it. So I decided I'm going to do something really audacious to launch this book, baby. I'm going to walk the 444-mile Natchez Trace Parkway from Natchez, Mississippi to Nashville, Tennessee with cars, trucks, camper vans, motorcycles in 15-mile increments every day for 34 days on a highway. And I'll blog about it and show readers where I set scenes. And something will go viral on the internet because nobody walks this road. It's a highway, and it'll snowball such that by the time I stagger across the finish line in Nashville, I will have sold hundreds or maybe even thousands of this book, baby. And maybe Good Morning America will come and interview me at the finish because nobody walks this road. And they'll put me on the national news. And I'll end up selling so many copies that I'll hit the New York Times bestseller list with my debut novel. I am the smartest author ever. So even though I can't run a mile without falling over, it won't be hard to walk 15 miles a day on a highway for more than a month. I mean, it's just walking. That's not hard, right? So I started training on dirt trails around my home in Charleston, South Carolina, about 3 months before this novel came out. And I was an idiot. I had no idea how stupid I was. I had a problem with my grand plan, though. The Trace is really remote, a lot of it. I don't know if any of you have been there, and I'm girly, and I didn't want to carry all my stuff and sleep outside on the ground for more than a month. I wanted somebody to drop me off at 1 mile post and pick me up 15-mile posts later every day and take me to a real bed and a shower. So I needed a wingman. And my husband was my first choice. I love Michael. I didn't want to be away from him for 5 weeks doing this hard thing to myself. But he has a really stressful job here in Charleston that still pays for my stupid proclivity to do this. So he could not take off 5 weeks and schlep me around Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee. But I have all these girlfriends, and they're always complaining about their husbands, children, jobs. Soccer is the most stressful thing ever, apparently. So I went to all of them and said, if you go with me for a few days each and help me, we'll have our big Thelma and Louise adventure together. It'll be great. And then you can go back to all your stress. And several of them were dying to go, but their husbands, children, employers weren't so excited. So I ended up with one friend who could go with me at the beginning for 4 days, leaving a chasm of time. 30 days and no wingman and only one name left on my scribbled out list, and it was my 80-year-old father. Now, we all have at least one person in our lives, don't we? And we're usually related to them, and they drive us insane, right? For me, that is my father. He's a nightmare. We've never gotten along. He's that person where you go to their house back when we could do that, and you grit your teeth through every second you have to be in their presence. And then as soon as it's over, you run out and say, thank God I don't have to do that again for a long time. But I was desperate. So I sucked it up, drove to his house, found him in his recliner. The house is vibrating from the sound of the TV because he never wears his hearing aids and he can't hear anything. He's got popcorn and peanuts all over himself and all around the chair. And I ignored all of that wreckage and said, Dad, you're sitting in this recliner waiting to die. You don't have anything to do. And I finally decided what I want to be when I grow up. I want to be a New York Times best-selling debut novelist. And it is a parent's responsibility to help their children reach their dreams however long it takes us to figure them out. So will you go with me, Dad, and help me reach my dream? And he said, spending 5 weeks with you sounds horrible. I'm not doing that. So I had to regroup, didn't I? As a writer, I hadn't done a good job of putting my reader in my story, had I? So I went back to my dad and said, Dad, you are the biggest Southern Gothic man I know. You have all these stories you like to tell that I've heard 5 billion times, but you really like to tell them to strangers. And there are all these strangers in these tiny towns along the Natchez Trace who've never met you or heard your stories. So while I'm walking 5 hours or so every day, you can go into those towns and do the Roy show, and they'll love you. And there are Southern dining establishments in these towns, Dad. They fry everything to death, and it tastes so good. And you can eat as much of that crap as you want, and Mom won't know, and I won't tell her. Would you like to do that for 5 weeks, Dad? And he said, I can't wait to get started. My people are waiting to meet me. When do we leave? So on March the 1st, 2014, To Live Forever, An Afterlife Journey of Meriwether Lewis was published, and I started walking from milepost 0 on the Natchez Trace outside of Natchez, Mississippi. I walked for 2 days. On the morning of the 3rd day, I was 30 miles in. I woke up and it was 20 degrees, sub-zero wind chill, and sleeting in southern Mississippi. Now for y'all living in Wisconsin, that's nothing. For me, as a lifelong Southerner, that was a significant weather event I didn't want to be out in all day. And people were following this all over the world, calling, texting, emailing, saying, just quit and go home. You know, you probably sold all the books you're going to sell by day 3 anyway, and we don't really care whether you finish this or not. But I knew by the morning of the 3rd day just how stupid this was. I trained on dirt trails around my home in Charleston, but the entire Southern Trace goes through a swamp. So I planned to walk on the dirt shoulder of the road, but when a road goes through a swamp, there's not one to walk on. So I spent the first 30 miles walking on pavement. My hips, knees, and ankles were on fire from the toll that was taking on me, and I was not adding miles to any day to finish on April 3rd. But I had to be in Nashville on April 3rd because Ann Patchett, a famous author, owns a bookstore in Nashville, and she said, you can come into my store and talk about this stupidness, but only on the day you finish. And you have to talk about what it was like to walk the entire trace by yourself as a woman. So I could not go into her store and say I quit on the 3rd day because it was cold and my feet hurt. So I got out there and I walked for 2 days in sleet and sub-zero wind chill. Whatever the weather was, I was out there in it. A tornado warning, some significant hail. A windstorm was blowing me into the highway in front of cars and trucks and camper vans all day, one day. Whatever the weather was, I was out there. By the middle of the 2nd week, I was in physical agony every second, but the physical agony was nothing compared to the agony of living with my father. He forgot to pick me up one day at milepost 135 north of Jackson, Mississippi. There's nothing there. Hadn't seen a car in 2 hours. Didn't have a cell signal to call him. So when he finally showed up, we had a nuclear holocaust of an argument. We were both calling my mother independently saying, you've got to come out here and save us because we're going to kill each other. And she said, ha ha, I'm not getting in the middle of that. So we went to our separate corners and avoided each other. And a couple of days later, he dropped me off at milepost 165. If you go to milepost 180 on the Natchez Trace, that is the geographic middle of Mississippi on this 10,000-year-old road that runs from Natchez to Nashville. And there is an astronomical observatory there because that is the darkest sky east of the Mississippi. If you're looking to physical distance right now, that's how much nothing is in the middle of Mississippi. So I started walking from milepost 165, and at milepost 167, I got this horrible stomach cramp. Now, I'm girly, but I'd gotten used to going to the bathroom in the woods on the trace. It's set up for people on wheels. Some of the toilets are more than a mile off the highway, and I was not adding miles to any day to use one of those. But I was violently ill next to a pine tree at milepost 167, sobbing, too sick to go on. I got out my cell phone to call my dad to tell him to come pick me up. I couldn't finish, and I didn't have a cell signal. So I went into my backpack to get out my toilet paper to clean up, and I had 2 squares because I had not checked my supply that morning. So I got out the only other thing I had with me, a big bottle of Gatorade, and I took the lid off and I dumped it around back there and swished it around. And if you're ever in that predicament, don't do that. So I cleaned up as best I could, got back out on the road, sobbing, looking at my phone, saying, as soon as I have a cell signal, I'm calling my dad. I'm telling him to come get me because I quit. This isn't just the stupidest idea I've ever had. It's the stupidest idea in history. Nobody's buying this novel. Nobody's interviewing me for the news. Nothing's going viral on the internet, and I'm a failure, and I want to go home. 2 miles later, I still didn't have a cell signal. So I just collapsed in a field and said, maybe eventually Roy Watkins will wonder where I am and he'll come find me and take me back to South Carolina because I can't do this anymore. And I lay there feeling really sorry for myself for about 15 minutes. Now, the South in the second week of March is really pretty, typically. It's before we get all that super humidity we have in the air. The sky was really open and blue, and I was lying in this field of thousands of daffodils. And I said to myself, I've been doing this walk like I lived my whole life. I've been rushing through every day to finish because I'm focused on how much my feet hurt and how miserable I am. And so I'm missing all the amazing things that are happening to me every day because I'm out here walking a highway nobody walks by myself. Thousands of birds were migrating. They were everywhere. A deer walked right here next to me for a while one day and didn't run away. A woodpecker stayed with me all day one day, and it would plunk trees on either side of the road like we were talking. So I was having magical experiences with nature, and people from as far away as Japan were stopping and talking to me and telling me their trace stories. But I was missing all that because I was concerned about the misery and agony I was experiencing every day. We all do that even today, even in 2020, when we've had this pause. We have so much discomfort right now and so much uncertainty. And we forget to find the amazing thing in every day. So the next time you're having a day like that, I hope you'll remember me in that field of daffodils and pull your head up out of that and find the amazing thing. Life is amazing. That's why we're here, to experience that amazingness every day if we choose to. I finished my walk right on time on April 3rd. I got into some TV and newspapers, had some people meet me at the end, sold a few copies of To Live Forever. Not enough to hit the New York Times bestseller list, but I did that with my second book, my memoir about this adventure, Not Without My Father. And there's a lot of other stuff in there that you can read about that happened to Dad and me. But the best thing that came out of this ended up being the 5 weeks I spent with my 80-year-old dad, who drives me insane. I've given this talk on 3 continents. This is only the second time I've done it this way, so I really appreciate your patience with me as I try to get my legs on virtual speaking. Because we all have people in our lives, don't we, like my dad. And now it's hard to spend time with them. You know, that's one thing that I've really learned from this. We have people that we need to make memories with, and we'll say, I'll do it someday. And then someday becomes never when they get sick or they pass away or the whole world changes. And we're left with, wow, I wish I'd done that thing. So I hope nobody ever meets me or hears me speak or lives through this moment and gets to the end and has a bunch of I wish I hads. As soon as you're able to, I hope that you'll grab those people in your lives that you need to make memories with and say, let's do that thing. Let's don't wait, because we've seen how fragile life can be and how quickly it can change. And we need to make those memories while we can so that we don't have I wish I hads. Turn those into I'm glad I did. I'm so glad I spent that time with my dad. We had conversations we wouldn't have had any other way, and he told me stories I hadn't heard 5 billion times, and we finally connected. And that's even more meaningful to me now because I can't see him, and he's 86, and he calls me all the time and can't hear a thing I say. But we still have that connection. He's too feeble now to travel. So we did that thing when we could, and I'm so glad, and you will be too. My publisher has put together a special deal for all 4 of my books, just for speaking groups who book me virtually this way. I have 2 other nowhere novels that I've written, Hard to Die, about Theodosia Burr Alston, who's Dear Theodosia in Hamilton, if any of y'all have seen that. And she disappeared at the age of 29 off the coast of North Carolina. So she has a fun adventure in the afterlife. And then my newest novel is I Am Number 13, which features the biggest scoundrel America ever produced. James Wilkinson worked for the first 5 presidents of the United States and took millions of dollars in today's money from Spain to sell our secrets. He committed treason his entire career and was never caught. So he's deliciously awful. And you can read about the adventure that he has. He's the villain in all my novels, but he narrates I Am Number 13. All 4 books, normal price, are about $27 on ebook. But with my publisher, you can follow the link that we've put up and get them all for $9.99 if you use the code NOWHERE999. So you have a bunch of stuff to read while you're still sitting at home. I really appreciate you're having me with you here today. If your book club ever wants to pick one of my books, I'd love to do something like this with you this way too, and visit your book club. I do that a lot and traveled a lot to do it before this happened. So I always love meeting people and talking about books. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.